Good evening. I'm Billy Chen, and I'm very happy to be here representing the Architectural League, which is co-sponsoring this evening with the Regional Plan Association. Our program tonight is titled Penn Palimpsest, and participating will be Vishaan Chakrabarti, who will present his proposal for Penn Station commissioned by the New York Times, Hilary Balon, curator and writer, Harry Cobb, architect, and Tom Wright, president of the RPA. Strangely enough, in thinking about this evening, I thought of Emily Dickinson, which, given the topic tonight, appears rather random. But clarity and simplicity is very hard to achieve. And compressing coal into diamonds is usually the work of poets. What I found particularly impressive about the work that Vishaan did is the apparent simplicity and clarity of the planning, and you'll see this tonight. Making an answer that seems simple and obvious requires compressing coal into diamonds. Welcome.
To the Architectural League, Rosalie, who's really done an incredible job pulling this together. I'm Tom Wright, president of Regional Plan Association. We're thrilled to be co-sponsoring this event. I think that every time we talk about this topic and these issues, there is just an enormous thirst and hunger for information. And I think it's indicative of both kind of what the discrepancy between what we have, what we could have, and the desire to see something greater. So I hope tonight you'll both kind of learn about what's happening and be inspired by what could happen, and maybe we will start to build momentum and a force towards this. What I'm going to do is give a little bit of a very quick overview to kind of provide the regional context and talk some about the infrastructure and the planning that relates to Penn Station and the West Side, and some of, not all of, but some of the kind of forces at play. Then I'm going to turn it over to my friend and board member, Vishaan, who's going to present the extraordinary vision that he came up with here. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with Hilary and Harry to kind of talk about some of the issues, and we will open it up to the audience towards the end. I think, and I am a planner, talking about simplicity, Billy, with this slide behind you might be a little ironic, but this is a kind of image to show where people come from and what mode they use to get into Manhattan. And from RPA, of course, for 90 years, we've been looking at this region and the evolution of it, its economy and its communities and the way we're connected together. And you do see very strong patterns kind of that emerge out of this. Where are the train riders coming from on Long Island Railroad, in the Metro Northland, in Westchester and Connecticut and the Hudson Valley, and parts of New Jersey. New Jersey, of course, is actually, while New York City is largely green, the subway riders, and then blue to the north and the west, and the east, I'm sorry, what you see kind of across the Hudson River is a much more chaotic form, representing the folks up in northern New Jersey and Bergen County who are driving in across the GW Bridge, likely, and then the very many bus riders. There is an extraordinary reliance on buses. More people take the bus into Manhattan each day than ride a train into Penn Station. In particular, just kind of to give it a little historical perspective, though, when you think back over the last generation and the transformation of New York's economy and what's been going on here, the connection across the Hudson River has been a vital one for New York City. While Long Island and Connecticut and New England kind of had developed earlier, over a century ago, with their kind of established commuter railroads and transit suburbs, New Jersey really has been playing a lot of catch-up over the last 25 years. In fact, as you can see from 1990 to 2010, while virtually there's no change in the number of Long Island commuters, residents coming into Manhattan today than there were 20, 25 years ago, New Jersey has been providing the bulk of the new people coming in. And so as you start to think about today, by the way, growing up myself in New York City, of course, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, our economic growth was virtually all suburban. For every 10 jobs that were created in the 31 county area here, which RPA studies, for every 10 jobs, one of them was roughly in the 5 boroughs of New York City, and 9 of them were outside New York City from 1975 to 2005. Northern New Jersey saw a lot of that growth, parts of Fairfield County in Connecticut, even Nassau and out to Suffolk County. For the last 10 years, that dynamic has changed. And since 2005, for just about every 10 jobs created in this region, 9 of them are in New York City, and 1 of them is in the suburbs outside New York. And so today, New York City is really the rapidly growing part of the economy. And as we look out at RPA over the next 25 years, we're making projections that this is going to continue. While we think that the Hudson Valley and Long Island will start to get more growth, Long Island in particular with the East Side Access Project, which will provide a 1-seat ride into a new basement underneath Grand Central and the 3rd track and other things happening there, still, most of the new commuters we anticipate coming into New York over the next generation are going to be coming from west of the Hudson River. That's because New Jersey has communities that are planning and building more housing, and they've been adding capacity to New Jersey Transit along these times. And so they have the kind of capacity, the potential, I should say, to keep growing. When you look specifically at the Hudson River and kind of how people get across it, and this nice graphic, I have to thank the wonderful colleagues and staff at RPA who break down these complicated issues into digestible parcels. What you see, the path actually does quite a lot of service to Lower Manhattan. The Hudson River tunnels take about 20% of the total traffic, mostly on New Jersey Transit, although Amtrak has been growing, and the buses a much larger percentage. So that's kind of the current system and how the reliance across the river exists. And again, this is a kind of economic ecosystem that benefits both sides of the river. In New York, as we think about the Hudson Yards and the growth of jobs that we want to have there, and in particular as we think about kind of the pressure on the housing market and the inability to keep up with the demand for housing, if we're going to continue to add jobs in New York City, we're going to need to have commuters coming in, and probably most of them will be coming again from west of the Hudson River. In New Jersey, economic growth has been very slow. And really the only bright spot, the most important industry for the state of New Jersey would be called commuting to New York City. So this is a system that's really important to both sides of the river. The problem is it relies on 2 really pretty terrible pieces of infrastructure. The bus terminal, which we won't talk about tonight, but we could probably have a seminar series on this, presents, I think, a lot of obvious problems people know about. The Port Authority has been riven by fighting over where a new terminal should go. This one is not sized enough to kind of handle the large buses that are coming in. It has structural problems, and it is just absolutely miserable. And so figuring out what to do about this is going to be really important. At the same time, the Hudson River tunnels, these are the 2 tunnels, over 100 years old, the tracks underneath the Hudson River. This is the entire real linkage of the Northeast Corridor. It's the weak spot and the choke point in the entire corridor from Boston to Washington. The tunnels kind of float in the silt underneath the Hudson River and move a little bit with the tide every single day. And they were flooded during Superstorm Sandy. Salt water got into the tunnels and did permanent damage to the concrete casings inside them. I've actually ridden through these tunnels in a special train that Amtrak has with a big plexiglass window and floodlights. And you see the cracks, you see the concrete falling off, you see puddles of water along the side of the tracks. When you're underneath the Hudson River, you don't want to see water down there. And so so Amtrak did an analysis a few years ago after Superstorm Sandy, and they concluded that sometime within the next 10 to 20 years, they're going to need to shut these tunnels down for a couple of years to do major repairs to them. They do it on weekends and evenings and things, and all they can do is slow the decline of these existing tunnels. So now we're in a situation where not only is this a kind of constraint on future growth, but there's the possibility that we could lose one or both of the tunnels fairly soon at an alarming rate. To understand kind of the capacity and what that would mean, right now there are 2 tunnels and trains are coming in and out all day long. And the capacity that you have is essentially 24 trains an hour. One of the things to understand is you can't run trains in through both tunnels at the same time because Penn Station is a terminal operation. It's very inefficient. Half of the operations in and out of Penn Station are currently empty trains. A full train pulls in from New Jersey or a full train pulls in from Long Island. People get off and an empty train pulls out. In the evening, an empty train pulls in, people get on, and a full train pulls out. And that creates a lot of traffic at the interlockings and in and out of the rail yards and across, of course, under the Hudson River too. The analysis kind of shows that if we were to lose one of these tunnels, it wouldn't go down by 50% to 12 trains an hour, but because you need to run the trains in both directions, you would be talking about a 75% reduction to about 6 trains an hour during the peak. That would be probably, that would, I think, send New Jersey into a recession, even New York. I think our economic growth would slow noticeably. This is kind of an unacceptable situation for us. So the project that's underway right now, and Amtrak has been leading this for a couple of years. There used to be a project called Access to the Region's Core, and in his infinite wisdom, Governor Christie canceled the project, probably the worst public policy decision of my lifetime. So Amtrak has revived it through what they're calling the Gateway Project. And this is now identified, you know, when you hear about President Trump and his infrastructure plans and things, this is considered kind of the #1 priority in the entire country. And the idea, Gateway, is not just a tunnel under the Hudson River, but you have to think of it as something starting in downtown Newark. It's a series of tunnels and replacements through the meadowlands and across various rivers. It's the tunnels under, and then it would come into New York City, Manhattan. The tube, actually, this was in a great deal of foresight, and give credit where it's due, the related companies and Senator Schumer after 9/11, Sandy, managed to get funding to build boxes for these tunnels underneath the Hudson Yards. And they would come in and terminate at 7th Avenue, essentially. The proposal includes actually demolishing the block between 7th and 8th Avenues south of the existing Penn Station to build a new Penn South station, which hasn't really been rendered or talked much about. Maybe we will later tonight. The good thing about this is it's moving ahead. There's been an agreement through the creation of the Gateway Development Corporation, and the federal government will pay for half of it, and each of the states will pay for 25% of it, and things are kind of moving ahead. But it's going to be an enormously expensive project. It's estimated right now at about $23 billion. And if any piece of it falls off, if we build the tunnels but we don't build the new station, we don't get any new capacity. If we don't build the Portal Bridge or the other pieces in New Jersey, you'll have trains backed up on that side anyway. So it all kind of is interdependent together. And the truth is, it's not enough. Because what it does is it doubles the capacity under the Hudson River. But when we talk about the new 95,000 riders and other things, it's probably not going to be enough. And in particular, looking at kind of the bus terminal issue, it's not going to allow people to divert off buses to trains, which is something we ought to be doing in the long term. At RPA, part of what we've been talking about, and we don't shy away from big ideas, is to say don't stop at 7th Avenue, but continue all the way to Sunnyside, Queens, what we're calling Gateway East. The idea then is that you could connect into the Long Island Railroad, the Amtrak tracks up to the New Haven line, and part of it is that by building a through-running operation, you're not kind of having half of the movements in and out be empty trains. And you get more capacity out of the system. Some of the estimates about this is that you get kind of 40% more capacity under the Hudson River, and also 60% more capacity under the East River. Folks may know there are proposals to try to bring Metro North, the New Haven line, down through Brooklyn and Queens into Manhattan and Penn Station also, called Penn Access. This would serve that. It would provide opportunities potentially to move freight through and kind of connect the suburbs for the first time to each other. But now what I've done is I've just made like a $23 billion project, a $30 billion project. I think the thing I want to kind of close with, as we look at the area and just talk about it, and as Vishaan starts to talk about the center of this, is that there is an enormous amount happening in this district, and there is going to be even more happening in the future. Whether Gateway gets extended past 7th Avenue into Sunnyside, Queens or not, we're talking about doubling or perhaps increasing by 150% the number of people coming into Penn Station from the west. Moynihan Station, as folks may know, is kind of moving forward. This was a proposal from Senator Moynihan originally to take the old Farley Post Office and build a new waiting area for Amtrak trains. It's a nice project. It'll add a much improved kind of waiting area, train hall for passengers, but it doesn't add new capacity to the system. And most of the people, kind of the problem with this scenario right now, is that what we're talking about doing is jamming more and more people, more growth coming into this area, with most of them still coming between 7th and 8th Avenues, between 31st and 33rd Streets. So that's kind of the setup, if I can, for Vishaan to talk a little bit about what we could do to try and fix the middle of it. So Vishaan, take it away. Thank you.
I have a cold, so I'm only doing elbow bumps, so I hope I don't offend anyone. Thank you, Tom. This is actually one of my favorite evenings for a number of reasons, but I think one of the most important is that it brings together two organizations, the Architectural League and the Regional Planning Association, both of whom I have the honor to serve on the boards for, and that bring together the two very sort of weird sides of my brain. You know, the genius planner that is Tom and his team at the RPA and the extraordinary work they do on infrastructure, and the genius poetics of the Architectural League as led by our fearless board chair, Billy Chen, and Rosalie Ginevro, her partner in crime. And I just want to say apologies both to Todd and my wife Maria, but Billy, you still give me goosebumps, I'm sorry. I just want to start, first I want to thank the New York Times. There's a number of people from the Times here, as well as the Ford Foundation, who gave us some very generous support for this project, including the ability to build the model that you see next to you. And I also very quickly want to thank firms that collaborated with us, Thornton Tomasetti on structural engineering, protective design, sustainability, Level Agency with Byron Stiggy on sustainability, Durham Consulting, we did a full cost estimate for this, Tangurian Architectural Models, who built this beautiful model for us, and then my team at POW, who have been really extraordinary and worked so hard and so diligently on this. Before I dive into the proposal, I wanted to pull back a little bit from the context Tom just set up for you, which is, if you think about the future of cities and the future of regions, we are headed more and more towards a kind of, you know, we're in right now this idea of the multinodal city. We're past the central business district. And I think this will only, with technology and with the right infrastructure, will continue into almost this kind of lattice framework of where people work and live and play. And what's interesting to me about that is that has the opportunity to help address a lot of our issues if we design it properly, in terms of social mobility, sustainability, and a lot of the challenges that we face. But it's reliant on infrastructure. And Harry Cobb will be on the stage later tonight, and about a year ago, maybe a little less, Harry was on the stage with Justice Breyer talking about his courthouse in Boston, and a few of the board members from the league commented, you know, why isn't there a design excellence program for infrastructure, as there is for courthouses and federal buildings? And it's interesting, I started thinking a lot about why I'm so obsessed with this topic of Penn Station and what the role of architects is and could be relative to infrastructure. And you know, recently, our former vice president made this statement, if I blindfolded you and took you out to LaGuardia Airport, you must think I must be in some third world country. Well, this image is actually from the International Airport in Calcutta, where I was born. So I miss Joe, but he's actually wrong. Third world infrastructure is better than our infrastructure at this point. And it's interesting to think about why that is. I mean, our major architecture organization just vowed to help President Trump with the infrastructure agenda. But let's really talk about what this statement was about. It wasn't about the 89,000 members of the AIA. What it was about was a kind of bureaucratic architectural complex that builds our infrastructure today, which is why every airport in the United States, if it's new, looks exactly the same, has many of the same dysfunctions, And it's because our best design minds, I would argue, are not tackling some of our more serious infrastructure problems. And I want to be careful here because I'm not actually trying to impugn or in any way criticize anyone's architecture, but I am an author and I think words matter, and I think in the times we live in, words particularly matter. And so this is a quote that was given to Michael Kimmelman, who unfortunately couldn't make it tonight, and I should mention that, but has been a tremendous leader on this subject. And Michael retorted to this question and said, we do remember how much Grand Central cost. In today's dollars, it cost half of what the station downtown costs, and it serves many times the number of people with far less retail than the station downtown. And I think one of the things we can't do as leaders in the profession is be glib about these issues. Again, when asked, what does it mean to design Fox News World Headquarters? Well, they're a disruptive social media company. Well, that disruptive media company with two alleged sex offenders on my left here are set up the situation that we are in today in terms of this presidency. And so you say, well, what does that have to do with Penn Station? I would say what that has to do with Penn Station is because you can't get to here without the last slide, which is this astonishing statement made from someone in our industry about privatizing all public space. So I'd like to argue that part of the importance of this debate around Penn Station isn't only the tremendously important economic and infrastructural issues that Tom laid out, but this basic issue about whether we believe in the public, whether we have a civil society or we don't. And in some ways, this destruction that occurred in 1963 is, in my mind, a kind of foreshadowing of the precise moment we're in today, where we are questioning whether we are all in it for ourselves or whether, as architects in particular, we can fight for something more, something civic, something that is bigger than both our own practices and our egos, and also bigger than ourselves as individuals. Because let's face it, this is what we're being told about Penn Station, and we're told it virtually every day. We look at Grand Central, we look at the neighborhood around Grand Central, and it's interesting, a lot of the buildings aren't so grand. Actually, the old Commodore Hotel, reclad by our current president, the Hyatt. But what we're being told is this exact neighborhood, that if you did this to it, it would all be the same. Right? I mean, what's the difference? You just put the station underground, it works, people get to where they're going, and there's a 20,000-seat arena on top. What's the difference? And so I was thrilled when last May the Times op-ed section approached us about, well, maybe we should talk about a better response than that, and something that's maybe more than what Tom described, which is the project in Farley, which I'll talk about in a second. And it was thrilling as a new architecture firm to go out and be able to respond to a client like the Times. And we really did start with that question. Why does Grand Central work so well in a way that Penn Station doesn't? And it really starts with the origins of the two stations. These are drawings that show both stations in scale with their relative neighborhoods around them. The stations are in black, the original stations, and the black outline is the land that was acquired as part of the station redevelopment. And so what you're seeing on the right with Grand Central is not just the new station, but an entire plan for a neighborhood called Terminal City, in which the station would connect out to and be very porous with the neighborhood around it, as opposed to an effort really driven by getting national rail into Manhattan that was not about the neighborhood, acquired very little land, in fact, bought land in the cheapest neighborhood it could find in order to build a grand station, yes, but a station that was never quite connected to New York City. And a lot of this research, I need to thank Hilary Balon, the architect James Sanders, who's here, Jill Johns, the author, and also, as well as former students who did a lot of this research, some of whom are on my team at POW now. And so in all of these drawings, 8th Avenue is in the middle here, you see 7th Avenue, and 9th Avenue. So in the beginning of the 1900s, they built this tunnel system. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary piece of construction. And this is largely the tunnels and tracks that sit between 7th and 8th, and then 8th to 9th. And what you see is the tunnels come out from underneath the Hudson River, they start to splay, and you have Farley sitting right here with limited access, really primarily access to the center tracks, and then underneath the garden and to Penn Plaza, the tracks in parallel between 31st and 33rd Street, between 7th and 8th Avenue. They built the station. I won't go too far into this. The station, obviously, an extraordinary, extraordinary piece of architecture, one of the largest projects the country had ever seen. It was built in this neighborhood called the Tenderloin. Many, many African-American families were actually displaced and sent up to Harlem. It was the beginnings of Black Harlem when this complex was built. And it was built there because it was the cheapest land the Penn Central Railroad could find to build a station in. And so they built this station. Next to it, they built the Farley Post Office. One of the things it's interesting to note is look at the scale of what's around the station. It's also interesting to note kind of some of the detailing of what's around the station. The station was built, it was beautiful, but it really in some ways was quite a fortress, as was the Farley building, which near as I can tell is the only building built in the 20th century with a moat around it. This because, of course, the post office used to transfer cash to the mail. There was a lot of security concerns with the post office. And then the inside of the train station, and you, of course, know the famous Baths of Caracola space that was in Norman McGrath's beautiful photographs. What's interesting is very little commercial activity, very unlike Grand Central. You came in from 7th Avenue really on one pedestrian route through a few shops that took you from 7th into the middle of the station, two porte cocheres, which are suburban kind of car drop-offs, because the whole idea was that the main user of Penn Station was supposed to be a somewhat wealthy national rail rider who would arrive, a chauffeur would pick them up and whisk them away. So it was a beautiful space, but I would argue not quite an equitable space in terms of thinking about the commuter shed and what would ultimately happen with commuters, although commuters experience some of these grand spaces as well. And then the real genius of the station, which is how to get people from the sidewalk level down about 45 feet through 2 mezzanine levels in the main train hall, which was situated on 8th Avenue, exactly where Madison Square Garden sits today, which is that red outline. And of course, that's because the trains are underground, they're newly electrified, and so people would embark the trains from the upper mezzanine and disembark from the lower mezzanine. And then time went on, Farley was expanded. There was actually a Greyhound bus terminal where One Penn Plaza sits today, and that in my mind is kind of a harbinger of what is to follow. National Highway Act passes, national rail ridership declines, even though commutation grows. And so what you have by 1960 is you have Penn Central Railroad nearing bankruptcy. Now mind you, all of this has been built by the private sector, and so what Penn Central decides to do is sell the air rights above the sidewalk, which is still true today. It's a split ownership. So the rail station's owned by what's basically the predecessor to Amtrak below the sidewalk level, and above is sold to private interests for a new arena and a new office tower. And we actually use some of Mr. McGrath's photographs to do some forensics on how the station was demolished, because what's interesting is the station is never shut down. And that's fascinating, because this is an enormously complex piece of construction. And it's the key to how to maybe change the situation today. What's done is, in 1965, a platform is built at sidewalk level that caps, basically puts a big manhole cover on top of the upper mezzanine and the lower mezzanine. And that cap really remains there today. It was to protect the passengers that were below grade. And then slowly they started demolishing the building from the inside out to try to keep the level of controversy down about the demolition. The demolition takes many years. This is an image from 1967, and I think it's just fascinating. You see the facade of the old station, and then you see in the background rising the superstructure of Madison Square Garden. Which basically brings us to our current situation of a 20,000-seat arena that's about that's almost a half-century old now, and 2 skyscrapers that are sitting there right today, and the Farley building across the street. And so this is, is the sort of garden spot of Penn Station. This is the Amtrak area, and that ceiling is the platform they built in 1965 to protect the passengers. That floor is the same exact floor level as McKim's upper mezzanine, which is also the roof for the really great place, the lower concourse. The lower concourse has about an 11-foot ceiling through most of it. It is the most used part of the station because it is where commuters transfer from commuter rail into the subways. 650,000 people a day, 3 times the number of Heathrow Airport, go through these concourses. It was built for much less ridership than that. But there it stands, the jewel of the Northeast Corridor. And so to fix this, or a proposal for this, as Tom mentioned, was Senator Moynihan's plan done by Skid Mornington Merrill in the early 90s. Many of you will remember this, to build a grand Amtrak station in Farley. It did have many issues. It had a lot of budgetary problems, but the larger problem was many of the railroads for years resisted because they felt Farley it was over the tracks, but it was too far west to really serve as a functioning train station. And some people in the railroad community still have those qualms about Farley. And as I said, it's an odd building. It's a beautiful Beaux-Arts building. It's a landmark, but it is built as a fortress. So it's very hard to imagine how a train station implanted in the courtyard of this building is going to somehow catalyze this neighborhood or change the basic dynamics of what's going on here, especially because, as Tom laid out, the real growth here, Amtrak is about 5 to 7% of the ridership of that 650,000 daily people. The real growth is in commutation. The real growth is in New Jersey Transit. So this big red line that's pulsing into the underbelly of Madison Square Garden is going to only continue as our region grows. And that's because the Garden is at the center of the platforms. It's at the center of the storm. Many people have recognized this for a long time. So this was an Olympia and York proposal back in the 80s to move Madison Square Garden to the Hudson Yards. Richard Meyer did a proposal for a rebuild of the Madison Square Garden site. 10 years ago, I was part of something called Moynihan Station Venture, in which Related and Vornado proposed moving the Garden to the back of the Farley building and building a new train station where the Garden now sits. We actually had support from the Times back then, and the whole idea was that instead of this, there's an SOM drawing, you can open it up to light and air, and the Garden would fit sort of like an egg in an egg cup in the back of Farley. There'd still be an Amtrak station in the front of Farley. These drawings were done by the Garden's architects. They got about a 20,000-seat arena. They got a proper loading dock, which they can't get today. They got a lot of things that you can't get in the current arena today. That's a section through the building with the train station in the front. Again, this is the Garden's architect's drawing. There are people who somehow say that the Garden doesn't fit in the back of Farley. It absolutely fits. The private sector spent over $100 million pursuing this deal 10 years ago, and they certainly would have flagged it had there been red flags on that issue. There were preservation concerns. Some preservation groups launched this ad in the Times, "Don't let it happen again," as if there was a brick wall in the building that was being demolished, and that was somehow blown into this idea that what happened in '63 was happening all over again. I think those issues are largely surmountable, but there were issues 10 years ago. One was, once the Garden moved, how did you pay for a new train station where the Garden sits today? The smallest estimates were $6, $7, $8 billion for a brand new train station because of the complexity with all of those people moving underneath it, protection, and so forth. The other big issue was that the reason the development community wanted to move the Garden wasn't just to build a new train station. It's because the Garden has about 4.5 million square feet of air rights floating above it. You can't build those air rights on top of an arena because you can't build the structure through the arena. And so they wanted to build it on top of where the Garden sits, with a kind of train station / shopping mall at the base. And the police looked at this, the railroads looked at this, and this was essentially tantamount to doing open heart surgery on a patient while they were jogging. ridiculously complicated, soon put aside, and went to Plan B, which was to build a shopping mall and a train station, and then sort of sprinkle the air rights around to adjacent sites. There weren't a lot of receiving sites for those air rights. It was a big problem. People were trying to solve that problem, and then this happened. When this happened, because this was a victimless crime, as you know, when this happened, the whole thing went to a halt. The Garden pulled out of the deal 3 weeks later because they didn't feel they had a counterparty in government. They knew the Barclays Center was coming up in Brooklyn and needed to build suites and things for sales. And then a few months after that, Lehman Brothers fell, and the entire conversation went dormant until recently, when basically the idea of building an Amtrak station in Farley was revived by Governor Cuomo. You know, we think this is a good idea. This is about a $1.6 billion project, I believe, to build this, as Tom said, this waiting room, waiting area in Farley. But again, this serves, by some estimates, 5% of the ridership at Penn. The people who really support Farley believe that a lot of commuters who are headed westbound will use it. That's maybe 20% of the riders at Penn. Even if you believe that 20%, it means that 500,000 people a day are still in the old station underneath Madison Square Garden. Then add to that what Tom just talked about, which is Gateway, when you're adding a new tunnel and new platforms in what's called Penn South, the block south of Madison Square Garden. And you're really adding insult to injury in terms of the number of people you're placing into that system. So this is, again, the lower level system, what I showed you before. Those are the existing concourses in that lower level. And the Gateway plans, you can look them up, show a plug-in from those new tracks and platforms directly into that 11-foot ceiling system. Right? And so we're talking about all of those people who are then going to transfer into the subway. They have to move north because of head heights and other things I won't go into. And so this is unconscionable. As much as I am a supporter of Gateway and believe we need the Gateway tunnels, the thought that we would bring even more people into the existing system simply does not make sense. What is interesting about Gateway, and this is a touchy subject, but Gateway, to build those tracks and platforms I just showed, will require the condemnation of about 1.5 blocks of Manhattan, just south of Madison Square Garden. And that's obviously a very sensitive issue for people who have businesses there and other things. There's not a lot of residents on those blocks. But that's something the government's going to have to contend with if they plan to build Gateway anyway. But what's interesting to us about it is it means that if that happens, that the air rights from Madison Square Garden finally have a landing spot, which means, in turn, that if those garden air rights can be sold, and there are ways to finance this so that these things don't have to happen sequentially in the way I'm talking about, and we can talk about this during the panel, it means that there is a financial mechanism to move the garden. And I fully believe that, given the right deal, that the garden would want to go to get that new arena. That leaves the major problem that I discussed from 10 years ago, which is once you move the garden, how do you get a new train station? And so the idea here is that maybe, just maybe, there is a new station hiding in plain sight. The fundamental problem with building a new train station is that you have to build in the train shed, very complex, very expensive, very time-consuming. So we had this thought, why not span over the train shed? The only thing is our structural engineers told us that would actually be just as expensive, just as time-consuming. And then I stumbled across this historic photograph. This is the ring beam that holds up the garden. There's a series of 9-foot-wide columnar trusses that act as columns that support that. And it's quite a beautiful structure. It just has a very, very ugly skin on it. And so we thought, why start from scratch? Why not recycle this thing? Why not reuse the foundations, the columns, even the roof? Bring down the cost, bring down the construction time. And so we started looking at assembly systems and saying, well, you know, actually in that 9-foot depth, you could put a double layer of curtain wall, and you could actually put automated shades in between. Byron, I got the automated shades in for you, to basically act as a passive heating and cooling system. just like King's Cross in London, that you wouldn't have tremendous heat loads or cooling loads from mechanical ventilation, but instead you could create this very light, airy pavilion, use the stack effect, do the opposite in the winter time, and kind of trap the heat from the trains. And most importantly, because of that passive heating and cooling, create open egress all the way around the station perimeter. So you'd have much safer and clearer egress in the event of an emergency, and use the oculus at the top for smoke purge, which is a very important thing during a fire event, and put blast-proof glass around it, which we work with Thornton Tomasetti on. But beyond those pragmatics, we were also thinking about architecture. And I've always been very influenced by Ken Frampton and by Jorn Utzon, and this sketch always stays with me, this idea of the tectonic frame over the sort of stereotomic earthy mass. This is one of Utzon's sketches of a Chinese pagoda. And was thinking about that as a kind of precedent, that of this ground that was coming down, that you could put this very light, airy kind of pavilion that would act as the main commuter pavilion. And so you would see a new garden in Farley, you'd see Amtrak in the front of Farley, and about 95% of the users in Penn at the heart of the platforms where the garden is today, where with the garden kind of hollowed out as this kind of pavilion, that would have a kind of, that double skin, a kind of sawtooth pattern, that would have a kind of solidity by day, but then by night would be glowing, and the underbelly of the ceiling, we would put a mosaic of the map of New York City, so when you came out of a train, sort of like the stars of Grand Central, but when you came out of a train, you kind of orient yourself immediately. This very pedestrian environment. And then this sawtooth pattern that's very much intended to catch light through the course of the day, so that because it's a commuter station, right? So it has this diurnal idea, right? As the sun moves, that the wall would change and never read as flat, but always have this kind of dynamism to it. And what's interesting is if you carve out the garden, and Amtrak's moved to Farley, Amtrak sits at that red line, that upper concourse, then that lower concourse that has an 11-foot ceiling today would have a 153-foot ceiling. We beat out the Pantheon by a little bit. It's higher than Grand Central. The Baths of Caracola space in the old station was 168 feet. And this circular form, and it's interesting, the era in which the garden was built, this kind of optimism about the circular form as this kind of idea, this kind of symbol of the gateway to the world. And so here, the idea of that circular form, what's interesting is, as Tom mentioned, there's all this planning going on with Amtrak and Farley and new concourse improvements to the north and to the east and Gateway to the south. But we found that no one was looking at this place as a place and saying, when you did all of these things, what did it all add up to? What was this new neighborhood? And so the potential for, in that donut of planning, for us to kind of inject jelly into the donut with that circle and pull it all together with this light pavilion structure and then these two retail bars, not a shopping mall, but just a small number of shops that basically negotiated between the circular form of the garden and the orthogonal form of the grid. So you read this above, but then down at the pedestrian level, it would kind of make its way and normalize itself into the grid using those retail bars. And then down below, that all of those local columns that support a lot of the inside stuff at the garden, about 70% of those could go away, it would get cleaned up. We would take the existing concourses, add a tremendous amount of vertical circulation, connect, and using the Gateway concourse plan, connect properly to Gateway so that there would be a real place for people to go as they got off those new tracks and platforms. And so you see this from above, but then, and you're welcome to see this in the model after the presentation as well, you see those platforms, and then as Farley slides away, you see why Farley works for Amtrak on those center tracks and platforms, which is predominantly where Amtrak operates. And then the beauty is the construction wouldn't be that difficult. You would basically take the skin off, you would take the bridge down between Two Penn Plaza and the garden because you don't need that bridge anymore. And in its place would go a proper taxiway so you could, with some dignity, get out of a train and into a cab. And basically complete it in a fairly small time frame. But what's so critical and what's so important about the lesson from Grand Central is that it's not just about the station as a building. It's about what does it mean for a brand new neighborhood in terms of being the central focus, a public space that then has new development around it, has old neighborhoods near it, has the High Line near it, has the Nomad Hotel, has all sorts of stuff that's happening in bits and pieces all around it, but it becomes truly the center and the heart of a new neighborhood. I'm going to close with a couple of before and afters, looking up 8th, after and before and after, the southwest entrance, after, and so what you're seeing there is that kind of stereotomic mass of the ground coming up to form these piers, the tectonic mass of the pavilions sitting on that, and because of the passive heating and cooling, this very open system, there'd only be sort of special shutters for rain and snow. From the platforms, that, of course, those brass balustrades are from the original station, would keep those, of course, but you would look up, and it wouldn't be about celebrating our architecture per se, it would be about celebrating arrival into New York City. From the subway, and even because that Amtrak level's gone away, even that low level where you're not under the high volume, you still have a 30-foot ceiling. And then the last shot, which is looking from the concourse and then back at the Farley Building. This would be the largest enclosed public space in New York City, and all done for a project cost of about $1 billion, which is about 20% of what downtown cost. If you add contingencies and so forth, maybe it's $1.5 billion, but a highly affordable price tag given what's at stake. But I think also this notion of a very light pavilion where it's not about a shopping mall, it's about a civic commons that's at the heart of this very, very neglected neighborhood. And then I just want to close with a couple of last thoughts, which is I was thrilled. We were asked to present this to Community Board 5. Michael, Tom gave the similar presentation that he just gave. And the Community Board laid out a resolution that was extraordinary. And it was unanimously in favor of studying this plan further, 28 votes in favor. And I think that this, to me at least, is very important. I feel our work as architects should be accountable out there in the world, not just to some sheikh or some mayor, but actually to the people we serve. And so I wanted to close on a more uplifting note about architects and some of the great things that architects are saying. And I think the things that most of the architects in this room, probably all of the architects in this room, really believe, that it's a fundamentally social act, that my friend Tatiana will work not just for luxury housing, but this notion of what true affordability is, and of course our Pritzker laureate, and what he's saying. And I think it's interesting, this statement generated a lot of controversy, but for me, in terms of this, some of the work we're doing with the Low Line, at Domino, thinking about what's unique, not just in terms of the architecture you create, but what's unique about the place that you're studying. What's really, truly unique about that and special about that. So this is what we're going to dedicate ourselves to. I started at the League by writing this blog called The Country of Cities that turned into a book. And it was really about this idea that the city is the last and best hope for humanity. After this election, I couldn't believe that more. And so we're going to dedicate ourselves to building all that stuff at the top to make a better city. So with that, I'm going to close, and I think I'm supposed to invite the panel up, and we can go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishaan, for that extraordinary presentation. I've done this a few times with him, and I enjoy it. He keeps changing it quite a bit, but it's fun to see. We're thrilled to have Hilary Balon and Harry Cobb here to kind of maybe have a conversation about some of the issues that Vishaan raised in that both, I would say, practical and philosophical presentation. And maybe, Hilary, if I can start with you. Since Vishaan presented both a kind of vision for the future, but also a critique of the history in the past, and you are, after all, the premier chronicler of Penn Station and what had there, can I ask you for what your reaction to his analysis of the station, of the history of the station was, and how it sets the stage for what we want to do going forward?
I agree with Vishaan's criticism of the station. It was built to meet a purpose that was appropriate at that time, and it didn't have the inherent flexibility to adjust to the changing patterns of ridership. This happened very soon after it was built, but I think it's understandable. So the Long Island Railroad, at the time the station was built, was an unprofitable railroad that was purchased by the Pennsylvania Railroad for one reason only, because it owned the Sunnyside Yards, and that was an asset that was important for the movement of the trains. The Pennsylvania Railroad never considered that there would be an influx of commuters from Long Island. So the station was never designed to accommodate those passengers. The mezzanine level, that low ceiling environment that Vishaan showed, was part of the original plan, but it was intended as the exit level, because the concept was that you would differentiate streams of traffic depending on whether they were exiting the station or entering the station. So the ground spaces were meant for arriving passengers, and those who were exiting were intended to take this less ennobling route. But I think that's one example of the way in which the building was flawed, and the notion of resurrecting, some aspects of this building really don't make sense for our own times.
Yeah. Well, there are kind of groups out there. We saw this downtown post 9/11. Folks talked about rebuilding the World Trade Center site as it was. There are certainly folks out there saying that Penn Station should be built in some kind of historical, classical form. You wouldn't be advocating for that or pushing for that.
I am not sympathetic to that view. First, I don't think it's practical, but in addition, we need a building that suits the 21st century and that we feel will serve the many more thousands of people who, as you explained, Tom, will be coming to it. But I do think that the memory of the great lost Penn Station is a powerful asset, because it gives us all a sense of an obligation, of something that we lost, a great quasi-civic building. I say quasi-civic because it was privately owned, but it had that civic aspect to it. And we feel that we've been deprived of something that we deserve. And I feel that symbolic legacy of the site is something that is mobilizing. And your attendance here, the response to so many of these panels about Penn Station, is very encouraging, because it signals this grassroots commitment or concern about the improvement of this important building for not just New York City, but the region and the whole Northeast corridor. So we should be inspired by the ambition of the original Penn Station, but we need to design for the 21st century.
Well, that's maybe a wonderful time to ask Harry to comment on how you would start to try to address design in a district like this. As I was looking at Vishaan's myriad and incredible photos, you see, I would say there's no clear architectural style for the district. It's like the neighborhood doesn't have any kind of, kind of common vocabulary going right now. Most of the action, of course, is below ground at the infrastructure level, as opposed to in the buildings themselves. And you have the McKim, Mead, and White building on the west side of 8th Avenue facing the garden. And frankly, none of us have kind of even really started to talk about what we would want to see in a third station in that district. So Harry, if I could ask you, how would you, if you were confronted with a challenge like this, how would you start to interpret a district like this? And what does design try to achieve in such a chaotic environment? Where do you start when you're kind of given a set of such chaos?
If you allow me.
It's on. It's on.
I'm on. I'll come to your question,
Okay.
but I
Answer the one you like.
want to start because I think it's important to start
Hold the mic closer.
Yeah.
As an architect, I really want to respond to what I saw this evening and heard from Vishaan, and then work out from there into the city. I'm a cautious person, and I'm constitutionally skeptical of opportunistic solutions. And what Vishaan is proposing is nothing if not opportunistic. But I'm completely persuaded by it, conceptually.
Good.
So,
There we go.
so what I normally would consider would turn me off is sort of turn me on. And the reason I feel that way does not have to do with your proposal as a work of architecture. It isn't really yet a work of architecture. It's a concept. It's the beginning of a work of architecture. But what I wanted to comment on is something that to me is absolutely crucial and that will have a lot to do with what should happen around it. The genius of this proposal, in my view, is in that ground plane plan. I wish we could put it on the screen. I hope you all remember it. That at street level, under Vishaan's proposal, what you have is a 400-foot diameter array of piers. You've clad them in marble, 9-foot deep piers. That array is completely permeable, and yet it defines in a very powerful way this place. That combination of defining the place and making it permeable is to me the essence of, and it's why this is better than a restoration of Penn Station, which was not permeable, which was extremely authoritarian in the way that it directed people, albeit with great grandeur. But in our time, what we need more than anything else is that combination, in my view, of a strong sense of place and at the same time, the sense that that place is open to everyone from everywhere. That's what this ring does. The second move that Vishaan made, which I admire greatly, is, and you noticed it in the ground plan, I hope, is that he brought in the geometry of the New York grid into this block. And it actually, and those pavilions, those orthogonal pavilions actually interrupt, if you will, that array. And that game between the circular array and the intervention of the orthogonal grids is, for me, very, very promising. Because that's what life in the city is about. It's about the meeting of opposites, about the joining, and it's about meeting in a way that doesn't exclude anyone, but rather invites everyone. So that ground plan is what really got to me when I saw this proposal. To me, it's the most important thing. The space above is crucial, the scale of it. That's where, however, I think Vishaan would acknowledge, has already acknowledged, that's where the diagram no longer suffices. Now it's a question, what is it going to be as a work of architecture? And here, I think it has great potential. And it's a very exciting problem to make that evolve as a work of architecture. I think it's an extraordinary beginning. And as I say, what's amazing to me about it is that something so manifestly opportunistic, because it's just there, can actually turn out to be so right. That to me is, and isn't it lucky that something like that can actually happen in the city once in a while if we know how to take advantage of it? So just quickly to go beyond that into your question. What does this mean? What it means to me is that in the blocks around it, that sense of permeability, of the ability to make connections, of the city as a generator of life needs to be present in the redevelopment of those blocks around it. And unfortunately, I mean, one thing that bothers me about this proposal is the sense that we may not get the Penn Station a la Vishaan until a whole lot of other things have happened which are going to take too much time. The thing that's so tempting about this proposal, so tantalizing, is that you could do it tomorrow. The day that the garden moves out, you could strip it down and literally, I mean, in a few months you could have it. So that's tantalizing, and yet what is needed in order to get the garden to move is totally beyond, I don't know, maybe we'll talk about that later, but that's what really worries me, is that this thing which would be so thrilling, and which, in my opinion, in view of the numbers of people involved, would literally transform the way people feel about this city at one stroke if you could do this today.
Yeah.
So I hope it doesn't have to wait for a whole lot of shoes to drop. But one of the issues obviously is going to be the redevelopment of the block to the south after that station comes in, and I would just like to. I noticed it today, and I just want to remind myself and everyone here how extraordinary the life of cities is. How every moment, and New York, nothing more so than in New York, but who would have imagined 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, that you could stand now on 31st Street next to Penn Station, next to the garden, and look west and see two skyscrapers framing that vista, with all the things that we know about that go with it in Hudson Yards. Who would have imagined? And so the energy that is moving east and west here is extraordinary. And I would hope that in the tough real estate world that we live in, when those blocks are developed, that energy doesn't get spoiled by the conventions of real estate, that there will be real vision going in both directions, by the way, east and west, north and south. The problem with the west side has always been, in my view, that the blocks are so long, and that's why you don't have enough connectivity. There's an opportunity here to break that 800-foot block long and begin to make connections.
That's a wonderful comment. I'm sure Vishaan wishes he taped it. But if I can to kind of piggyback off of that, as you talk about permeability, because I think one of the conundrums about Penn Station is that even it is at the crossroads of the entire region, and it's a place where the region comes together, we are a highly segregated and parochial region, and the structure today, and even as planned by the powers that be for the future, kind of, if anything, reinforces that segregation. And so the permeability that you talk about, I mean, quite literally, you can look at plans for Moynihan Station and have people talk about, and this is where the tickets for Long Island Railroad will go, and this is where the Amtrak riders will be, and thank God they don't have to mix with those people from Long Island. And I mean, it is actually kind of being planned to maintain and continue what I would call a kind of a segregated attitude, a chauvinistic attitude even, of one part of the region for the other. And I think, Harry, you kind of talking about the permeability and what it becomes is actually very different, because it becomes a part that brings together communities as opposed to segregating them from each other, which is literally the way the separate planning for the Long Island Railroad concourse and the Amtrak station and where New Jersey Transit will go in the future. Vishaan, if I can ask you to kind of comment on what Harry just said, and particularly kind of that relationship and the permeability versus the grid and other things. And maybe kind of not just, I'm going to keep pushing you guys. I'm looking for them to do my job for me, which is to figure out how this all gets done. But if it's part of a larger district, as Harry said, you could do this kind of tomorrow, but of course from the RPA perspective, I want these pieces to fit to each other. So how does your design concept then start to lead to a rethinking of the rest of that district? And what does it mean for it?
Well, first I have to thank both Harry and Hilary for the very kind words. But you know, what I wanted to actually point to, and this isn't log rolling, but I think it's an important point, is Harry just completed a world-class building called 7 Bryant Park. If I told any of the older New Yorkers in this room that there was a world-class office address being built on Bryant Park, if I told you that 20 years ago, you'd all say I was crazy, that such a thing is impossible, that Bryant Park is a crack den, and you know, that's not where we put our world-class office building. And I think it goes to Harry's point about how astonishingly quickly the city changes. You know, when I worked in the Bloomberg administration, my wife used to crack this joke when I'd work late, like, what's there, a city planning emergency? Is something going to happen in 40 years instead of 30 years? And so, you know, we actually have shown that we have the capacity to do these things and do them quite quickly. By certainly by Western standards. And the thing that I think is then very important is that everyone has to hold in their mind the imagination that that neighborhood can be something vastly different than what it is today. And I think it's very hard to do. You walk that neighborhood and you don't feel like it's a neighborhood. You don't feel like you want to be there. And I think this is a big sea change that we need to make sort of cognitively as we think about the neighborhood. But then it's all about the small moves. And I love the fact that Harry is very focused on something that we spent a lot of time with, which is that question of the ground plane and porosity, and that porosity moving through the street grid. And he's absolutely right. Those 800-foot long blocks on the west side are deadly. That's why when the planning happened for the Hudson Yards, there's a big boulevard going through the middle of all of those blocks. Why the High Line is interesting, because it cuts through that 800-foot dimension. So I think that kind of permeability is very important. And then lastly, what I would say is maybe unlike Hudson Yards, that it's an opportunity, like I think in the Garment District and some of these older buildings, that just like we're reusing the garden's structure, that we can think of some of these older buildings not as these older buildings, but as the kind of stuff that, you know, Facebook and the future Facebooks want to move into, and create a kind of different kind of ecology there in terms of what's there and who's there. And I think very quickly you could see that neighborhood become something that's much more diverse. And I think the community board saw that.
Mm-hmm. Could I just add something that strikes me as you're talking? That block to the south, which you have to expropriate in order to build your new station. And therefore it's going to have new development. Of course, if you transfer all the air rights to those sites, as Vishaan has suggested, truthfully, I fear the worst.
You fear?
I fear the worst.
Yeah.
And the weakest image you have is your image of what would happen on that block when you transfer the air rights. I mean, you don't want that to happen. I think the generosity, the permeability, the sense of the city that it belongs to the people needs to extend outside your new Penn Station and needs to be felt in what happens adjoining it. So I'd like to see a significant public open space in that block. I'd like to see a green space. I'd like to see a companion to your station as part, and I think that this is where we always have a problem in New York because, well, in every city, but New York is especially so, that the economics of development and the real estate market are driving everything without any balancing force.
Without, yeah.
And it's not that they shouldn't drive everything. It's fine that we need that energy. We need the energy that produces, but you need a balancing force. And it's curious that, and you see that balancing force in, let's say, for example, in Hudson Yards. There's a lot of balancing forces. I mean, that's a private development, and yet there's a lot of public realm stuff in there. There's a lot of negotiation, a lot of we need to figure out how, in the process of getting this Penn Station done, your question is absolutely right. How do you get that spirit to extend beyond that block, and how do you begin to show how it can be a model for city building?
Rosalie, I think we have an idea for a future architectural league competition or something, or exhibit or something. Hilary, I'll let you, and then I will ask folks if they have questions themselves and want to come up to the microphones. I'll offer that up.
Well, Tom, you pointed out the inadequacy of the bus terminal, and you also mentioned that there isn't much discussion about what a Gateway South terminal might look like.
Right.
And one great value that I see in the potential speedy completion of Vishaan's both revelatory and obvious solution is the momentum. It could, what?
I said I try to be as obvious as possible. You can ask my wife.
Well, it's just so convincing. I mean that in the best possible way. You see it, and as someone said, okay. There's so many other significant issues that need to be considered. And if we try to bite them all off at the same time, I think it will seem very overwhelming. But potentially building this new Penn Station can give us the kind of energy, the confidence that we can tackle these important issues. And you probably better than anyone could speak to the question of leadership. I mean, to Harry's point, who will be the strong advocate for public space, for the public interest as all of this development proceeds? And how will we adjudicate the allocation, ultimately, of scarce dollars for so many very significant and expensive big infrastructure projects?
Right. And as I was saying earlier, to some degree, the good news is there's a partnership between all these major players at the federal and state level, and yet at the same time, that creates a more diffuse leadership. The Gateway Development Corporation has representatives from the states and the federal government. There's turnover on an annual basis. One of those 4 seats will turn over every year, and it's not really clear who's actually going to be in charge. I mean, I say that. There is one person who holds more of the strings than anybody else, and that is obviously Governor Cuomo, the governor of New York, much more so even than the mayor of New York City. But nothing can be done without. It's very easy to stop these things. And we have created a kind of institutional structure that resists concentrating power, and so it's hard to imagine an institution having the ability to do this. I promised, if folks want to ask questions and come up to the 2 microphones, I'll invite the audience to do that. But I am going to ask you to be brief. We only have about 10 more minutes, 15 more minutes. So please, sir, first you, and then we'll go across.
Just quickly, I stand in the camp that would like to see more of the old station. But the one thing I'd like you to address is we're not dealing with the old station. So if you built something that was as close to replica as you could design into it some of the egress and egress problems that you discussed, particularly with those carriageways that you found offensive. So how do you respond to that? I mean, we're not dealing with the 1908 building. We could be dealing with something that I think with some creativity could work.
Do you want to take that?
I mean, I just fundamentally, thank you for your question. I just fundamentally don't think we're dealing with 1908 at all. We're well past that moment. What's interesting about the original building is, you know, it actually was an old building for when it was built, in the sense, I know it's heresy to in any way impugn the integrity of the old Penn Station, but if you look at other architects working at that time, like Carrere and Hastings or Warren and Wetmore, they were building much more modern buildings than actually the original Penn. And so, look, I wish the original station had never been torn down. I don't think there's anyone sitting here who wishes that that station had been torn down. But we now live in a different era and have, I think, a need for a very different architectural expression than what that station represented. This is now a city of 8 million people, many of whom were foreign born, many of whom, I'll include myself in this, don't feel that the expression of that old station represents them or relates to them in any way. It might feel neoclassical to some people, and it may just feel oppressive to others. And so I just think we live in a different age, and we need to find a different form of architectural expression for that age.
Vishaan, I would say that your scheme actually captures some essential qualities of the old building, not stylistically, but it was important to McKim, for example, to connect the below-ground tracks, and this is at a moment when electrification is beginning. So the possibility of having enclosed tracks is a new thing in New York, but they're connected through the skylights to the sky, and you open that connection back up.
Principles are there.
Yeah, and there are many principles, and that's how I would think about it if one is trying to say, no, we can't rebuild the old building, but there are certain elements of it that might be relevant to solving current problems.
That's a great way to look at it. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you very much. My name's Alex. I just have a quick question. One of the themes of tonight has been connectivity, connecting sort of the suburbs of the different parts of the region and tying together people through the idea of permeability, et cetera, et cetera. One of the weaknesses of Penn Station, and it was mentioned sort of in the prologue in the introduction, is the idea that it is a terminal station.
Yes.
You do have the LIRR terminates there, trains going back, same with New Jersey Transit, and that was also one of the weaknesses with the ARC proposal, that you had sort of a terminal station that didn't connect the region. How does your proposal deal with the idea of through running? How does it help, let's say, the LIRR and New Jersey Transit work together better to actually implement and increase capacity through running? Sure. Which would, in some ways, if you did do that, you wouldn't even need Gateway South, because those platforms would be enough with through running to increase capacity and not need to, blow up a whole block in the city.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I know what you're referring to. So the idea, again, a kind of terminal operation is a very inefficient way of running a train station, and through running has more capacity. I'll disagree with you. I know what you're talking about, the proposals to kind of create, to rebuild the tracks and platforms in the existing Penn Station to make it through running. Engineers, others I've talked to have looked at that and have essentially discarded that as a real possibility. There are tracks 1 through 4 kind of terminate with some hardware to the east of them. What I think I was trying to propose very briefly at the outset of this was an argument that the Gateway project should be a through-running operation to complement the terminal operation of the existing Penn Station, which is comparable when you kind of think of the systems in many of the other global cities. London is one we look at. You have kind of, right now still, even I think Vishaan's first image of the future city, of the kind of interconnected city, was a wonderful one, but still at this point, probably for the next 100 years or so, we will still have more people trying to commute into the center of the city in the morning and out in the evening. Creating connections through the city, through interoperability and through running is beneficial and something that should be added on to the system that we have today, as opposed to trying to kind of discard the system that we have and radically restructure it. So that's kind of, I guess, the way I would suggest trying to deal with that.
Well, I'm kind of in the camp too of I'm interested in exploring the idea of replacement Penn Station in some form or other, when it be adapted in some form. But to Henry's point earlier about taking an initial idea and making it into great architecture, we mourn the loss of Penn Station. Grand Central Station is the second most popular tourist destination in New York City. There's something about the architecture that makes people care, why it lifts their spirits, why it changes their perception of the city. You know, the Scully line about scurrying in like rats at Penn Station. But, you know, what I'm watching it in the Hudson Yards area in West New York, and you can see it from Riverside South all the way down, is this kind of glassification of Manhattan, this kind of monotonous, repetitive, soulless, corporate type of architecture that's slowly consuming that side of Manhattan. And it's not like a Robert Moses absolute destruction of a neighborhood. Midtown is being removed piecemeal, bit by bit, but replaced with these kind of soulless glass buildings. And so I want to kind of inspire everybody here to want something that is memorable, special, is not like any place in the world, is special to New York. And when you showed the image of the Calcutta airport, I actually thought this is what we were going to be seeing tonight. I want you to like really push this idea of this panel, whoever else is involved, to really get this architecture to be worthy of New York City.
That's a great comment. Actually, Harry, could I ask you to kind of, do you have a response to, since you've, I think of you and the materials that you've chosen to work with in your career, and how you would address something like that. How would you think about that?
You know, in the city, the way to think about it is to think about every place in the city as a distinctive place, that has a history, has a character, there's something there, and every time you build in the city, you're either contributing to that, enriching it, or you're subtracting from it. And the thoughtlessness of too many urban buildings is a subtraction from the quality of the city. There is, I mean, one of my problems in thinking about this or responding to it at all is I believe so much, I don't believe in generalizations. I don't think there's any general principle that you can apply to any. It's very dangerous to think in generalizations. So for me, everything is in the specifics. Everything is in the joy of the particular place and the particular opportunity that's there to make it distinctive and give it character. It's very hard to go beyond that for me. It's very hard to think about it and to try to. There are no rule books.
Yeah.
Most good things that happen in the city break rules. Many good things that happen in the city are done by not necessarily the best motives either. Many of the worst things that's happened in the city have been done by very good motives. So, you know, unfortunately, that on the other hand is what's so exciting, that the sad thing about Penn Station is not so much that it went away, but the way it went away. The way it went away into a really, and that's why it's such a tragedy. I don't think I sort of agree with what Hilary was saying, and that the loss of that building is not such a tragedy, but the tragedy was the spirit in which it went away, the reasons it went away, what replaced it, all the kind of sense that the city is dying, that there's nothing there, that there's no hope, that, you know, that's what went away in the.
It wasn't just the railroad that was bankrupt. It was,
Right, it was us.
it was much
It was
more.
us. May I just build on that? Because I think the absence of generalization is very important here. But I just want to say to the person who asked the question that I absolutely agree with the spirit of your question. And I think that we have seen this barrage of soulless buildings that could be anywhere being built here. But I don't think that that is equally said for all glass buildings, whether you look at the Rose Pavilion, or if you look at what's been done at Lincoln Center, or if you look at even the steps at Times Square. I think there are a lot of different examples of how glass can be deployed, and it can be deployed in a way that's awful and sterile and soulless, and it can be deployed in a way that's absolutely stunning and beautiful. You can go to the Cartier Foundation in Paris and see some of the most beautiful glass deployed in a building in the world. And so I think it's extremely important not to make generalizations. And I would also just really emphasize what Harry stated about it really being the beginning, and part of why I showed those model shots is this whole idea about the way in which light would model the building. What I would fear equally in your question is the notion that because we have seen so many banal glass buildings or so many banal modern buildings, that we should somehow try to go backwards. And I don't think that's ever been the solution. We've seen buildings try to go backwards. They've been equally banal. And so, this is why we have to keep trying.
Great. Thank you. Wonderful question. Yes, sir.
All right, so I just wanted to start with thanking all of you guys. This is perhaps one of the most interesting presentations I've seen, in part because of what Harry had brought up, this notion of balance of all your expertise, both in terms of economic, historical scales, urban scales, and autonomous building. My question, you might not have enough time to address this, but what I felt watching your presentation was seeing two parallel presentations, one to deal with the economic potential and the development potential, and one, a proposal that deals with the social and civic kind of potential of this project. I was wondering if both these presentations could speak more to each other. Yeah.
Tom, I didn't hear the question. Would you mind?
I think the comment was that the presentations that Vishaan and I gave, very different presentations, mine focused more on kind of the economic potential and Vishaan's the cultural potential of the area, and that we should have spoken more to each other. And I think that's a fair critique. I'm not going to,
I wanted you guys to elaborate more on the interdependencies of your proposals to kind of make them explicit.
Well, if I can, I'll start and give him a chance to give a better reply then. What I was trying to do was to set the stage for Vishaan. There is an enormous amount at play. The dynamic right now, kind of about the changes in the regional economy, the changes in the city economy, the changes in infrastructure, the changes in technology, where people live, where they work, all these things, is creating a kind of very, very fluid situation with failing pieces of major infrastructure that we've sat on for 50 and 100 years that we haven't maintained or kind of kept up with. So I'm trying to kind of set the stages. What I really do think is that we are in a kind of extraordinary moment where right now we will either grab this and start to do the kinds of things that Vishaan and Harry and people are talking about, or there's the possibility that, talk about go backwards, you could have, an engineer could go through the tunnel sometime in the next few weeks and decide that a crack has gotten worse than they thought it was going to, and they could shut down one of the tunnels. This is what happened. Truth is, the only reason Gateway's moving is because about 2 years ago in the middle of the summer, an electrical conduit blew up. It's a conduit, I had the comment once of saying it looked like it could have been a set piece for the first Frankenstein movie, but then Tony Kosha, the chairman of Amtrak, corrected me because it was older than the first Frankenstein movie, literally. And it blew up and it knocked out service for 2 weeks. And I've spent 15 years working on this issue, seeing very little public recognition. But when you lost service for 2 weeks in the middle of the summer, yeah, people suddenly paid attention. And it went from Andrew Cuomo saying, "It's not my tunnel," to "I have to do something about it." And there's the possibility of something that dramatic actually happening. The bus terminal could have, engineers talk about concrete chunks falling off of it. Vishaan talked a little bit about the safety issues in the existing station. It is not safe. It would not be permitted today. It is absolutely way off in terms of what we would consider acceptable in terms of the risk factor and things. So it's a kind of very fluid and dynamic situation with a lot of things changing and enormous pressure coming to bear. And I think that Vishaan, let me, from a personal basis, when he called me to say he wanted me to come over and see his proposal for moving the garden and doing this, I kind of said, we were past that. I tried it, I got the scars on my back. We're now just focused on the tunnels and things. And what I think Vishaan has done with his proposal is reconnect the civic culture and a kind of idea of the city moving forward with what I see as necessary to continue to provide prosperity, opportunity in a growing and thriving metropolitan region. So I think that these things do connect to each other, and I'm sorry that if we didn't really convey that well before.
Yes.
James.
Thank you. This is such a wonderful proposal and project, and it's been an honor to see it emerge and grow and perhaps help a little bit on it. I just wanted to call attention actually to two things which I think were implicitly said, but I'd actually like to bring them out because I think they're both really rich. One is I was startled when I first saw it, of the ingenuity. You sort of alluded to it, but the sheer kind of ingenuity of the staging, which sort of rolls in reverse, like a reverse film going in reverse. If you imagine it, how did they build it? Well, of course, they had to keep rain off everyone's head while they were doing it. They couldn't take the building off and let it rain on people. So they built this roof, basically, inside the building. And they could only, obviously, if you look at it, build Madison Square Garden after they had built the roof. So you're effectively saying the other way around. Leave the roof. Yeah. Do all the work you need to do to Madison Square Garden with that rain protection, just like it was built, only in reverse. And then one day, almost maybe rivaling the Chrysler Building spire going up, start taking the chunks of ceiling or roof out to reveal this incredible space, which will now be complete. That'd be pretty amazing. Yeah. The other thing was alluded to, I think, by Hilary, but I'd like to make a point about it. It goes back to the thinking we've been doing for a long time. Part of the reason it seems to me that Penn Station is such a disaster is because it's so disorienting. And one of the things you immediately think of when you think of Grand Central is the orientation factor that the big room gives you, in part because of the natural light. And it was something certainly that McKim was very alert to. The almost unconscious human need to go to the light would, I think, in this scheme be such an extraordinary thing. No one would ever get confused where they were in Penn Station, again, because our eyes are so subtle to wherever it's brighter and wherever you can feel, at least during daylight hours, the natural light of the sun coming down, you will always walk in that direction. And if that direction takes you out, that's a wonderful thing, and it's spiritually a wonderful thing for ordinary days, but one could imagine a day when it would be more than a spiritual thing for people to just automatically, in some problematic situation, know where to go and how to get out. And whenever we're in Penn Station, we're always aware of the scariness of the situation. So I think that intrinsic gift of bringing the light, what McKim knew you would be bringing the light back down, I think would be such a powerful gift in both the upside and the downside, so to speak, of life in New York. So thank you again.
Absolutely. Wonderful comment. Do we have any more comments or no? Well, then I think, okay, one last question. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm an architect who preserves old buildings, but I totally respect your saying, but I'm going to speak now as someone who's grown up taking the Long Island Railroad. But more importantly, the elephant in the room is Governor Cuomo, as you mentioned. And I understand this proposal as an infection or a virus that can cure cancer, and I hope it can do that. But please address the elephant in the room and where this, where the concept, in effect, is going for the stakeholders, because we live in a transactional political environment now.
Yeah.
And I think the air rights question seems to be driving, I think, part of what Vishaan has presented. Thank you.
Well, maybe that's a wonderful kind of question or comment to try and end on. I was thinking when Harry made his reference to being skeptical about opportunism, that's why he's not a planner, because in my world, being opportunistic is the name of the game. I have to be. We kind of always look for opportunity and ways to work things. And I kind of look at this audience and I think, well, here's my opportunity. I hope that everybody here kind of is inspired by the vision that Vishaan laid out. I think the extraordinary commentary that Hilary and Harry have provided, which has given me a deeper understanding of the issues around this, but you're now part of the ground troops to try to change what's happening. Because this isn't really, I mean, I think what is most likely to happen is that Gateway is going to keep kind of plodding along. It's going to be delayed. It's going to go in small bite-sized pieces. And we'll see we'll get a new bridge over the Hackensack River, and we'll start a tunnel, and it'll slow down and things. It'll move kind of slowly. And the danger would be that at the end of a process, and we'd get a new waiting area in the Farley Post Office, and eventually we'd get a tunnel without a new station in New York and other things. And someday, as it all starts to come together, I suspect, somebody who owns Madison Square Garden will raise their hand and say, hey, gee, we'd like to find somewhere new. We think we'd like to move somewhere else. And it'll be too late because the back of the Farley Post Office will be gone. There won't be good sites for it. And there will be a kind of exhaustion that is set in by that time because we've kind of made do with what we had. And so I think one of the questions I didn't have a chance to ask these guys was, is this kind of a marathon or a sprint? And Harry sent an email back, I think, saying it's both, and that's right. And so I'll be opportunistic and ask you all to feel like you are now part of the team and the group trying to get something better done in this area. And whether it's becoming active with your community board, whether it's talking, kind of addressing the elephant in the room, the governor and the people who run the major agencies, the federal role in this, public officials and others. There are going to have to be a lot of people involved, but I think we all have a stake in seeing this happen now. And so I just want to thank a wonderful panel and a wonderful audience, and let's go make it happen.